That's great.
All right, I think we can start. Yeah, okay. So welcome to our second webinar in the Children for Children webinar series. Today, October 13th, is actually the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. So we thought it would be appropriate to run a webinar about disaster risk reduction and different ways that we can kind of mitigate the negative consequences of climate change. So to start, we just have a few guidelines for this webinar. You will be muted upon entering. Please don't unmute yourself to avoid interruptions in the presentations. If you do want to ask a question throughout the presentation, feel free to write it in the chat and we will try and answer those. If you would like a certificate of participation for this webinar, you need to write your name and email in a private chat to Saga Kinstrand, who's also in this webinar. And we will be recording the webinar and it will be uploaded to our Wiry International YouTube channel. And the next upcoming webinar that Wiry is hosting is actually going to be a Wiry workshop specifically designed for students interested in participating in the Wiry program to learn more about the program and find out why it is so much fun. And that will be on the 27th of October at 3 p.m. CEST. So for today, we have two excellent speakers. We have Kevin Glinton, who's BREEF's Education Coordinator and EcoSchools National Operator. And we also have Olivia Copsey, who is a specialist in education for sustainable development and has worked with EcoSchools in the Indian Ocean and currently in Uganda. So for a brief overview of the agenda for today, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Children for Children campaign. Kevin will talk about the role of mangroves in the Bahamas. Olivia will speak about disaster risk reduction in schools. And then we will introduce some specific education materials that can help facilitate teachers and schools in participating in the Children for Children campaign. And then we'll hopefully have some time for a discussion or some questions from the audience. So to begin, the Children for Children campaign was launched in November 2019 by the Foundation for Environmental Education, specifically for EcoSchools in the Bahamas. The Bahamas is made up of more than 700 little islands and cays in the Atlantic Ocean and sits right between like USA and Cuba. It has a population about 385,000 people. The capital is Nassau, and it's 7 times smaller than Portugal, and yet 35% of Bahamas land area is coastline. Also, in September 2019, the Bahamas was hit by Hurricane Dorian, which was a Category 5 hurricane, which caused billions of dollars in damages, leaving about 70,000 people homeless. And a lot of the homes and structures on the islands of Abacos and Grand Bahama suffered severe damage and were destroyed, including 12 eco-schools, part of the FEES eco-schools network, were severely impacted by the hurricane. And last week's webinar, we got to meet some of the teachers and administrators from some of these schools. In response, FEE and our partner, the Bahamas Reef Environmental Education Foundation, decided to launch the Children for Children campaign to help support in the rebuilding of the eco-schools in the Bahamas. The goal through the Children for Children campaign is to raise awareness in the increasing vulnerabilities to national disasters as an impact of climate change and to support the affected schools by mobilizing support through the global community of eco-schools. So we wanted it to be an opportunity for schools and teachers and students to engage with issues of climate change, disaster risk reduction, resiliency, as well as building a sense of empathy and global community. And it will also give students skills involved in running activities and organizing a campaign. There are a few ways to participate. These can all be found on the EcoSchools website, which I will show you at the end of this webinar. But the general idea is that students and teachers organize and run an awareness campaign that includes fundraising activities to raise donations for the eco schools in the Bahamas. Alternatively, or additionally, we were also inviting schools and students to send positive videos of support for the teachers and students impacted at the eco schools in the Bahamas. We also have a number of fundraising ideas as well as educational materials that can help in implementing the campaign in your school. And I'll go more in depth to those at the end of this presentation. But for now, I think we can start with our speaker, Kevin, who will talk about the role of mangroves in the Bahamas.
So good morning again to all. Good day, my name again is Kevin Glinton, the Education Coordinator and Eco Schools National Operator at the Bahamas BREEF Environment Educational Foundation. BREEF was founded in 1993 by the late Sir Nicholas Nuttall with a mission to promote the conservation of the Bahamian marine environment that sustain our way of life. We at BREEF believe that an educated public will take action to protect resources which we all depend. Today, I've been tasked to share on the topic the critical role of mangroves in protecting the Bahamas. The Bahamas, again, includes its people, inclusive of the various ecosystems found here. This picture of nurse shark pups against the backdrop of red mangroves, which we will discuss in detail soon. At the end of this presentation, we hope to have accomplished these objectives. Wetlands, again, are any natural land area that is saturated with water permanently or seasonally. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll focus on mangrove creeks, or mangroves found on the coastlines of the Bahamas. Mangroves are found in tropical and subtropical regions around the world. They grow on riverbanks, in shallow water, lakes, ponds, or on sheltered coastlines where there's little wave action. Over a third of the world's mangroves have disappeared. Wetlands comprise 40% of the land area of the Bahamas. Mangrove forests hold up to 4 times more carbon than other tropical rainforests. And there are over 80 species of mangrove plants around the world, but there are only 4 found here in the Bahamas. Just 2 examples of mangrove creeks found in the Bahamas. On the left is the old Freetown walkway through the Mangrove Creek in the Lucayan National Park. That's on Grand Bahama, one of those islands affected by Hurricane Dorian. And on the right is one of our favorite areas where we take children at BREEF from Bonefish Pond, found right here in New Providence, where I'm located. Both are what we call coastal wetland areas or creeks. Mangrove wetland ecosystems are mucky with unstable soil, low in oxygen, and sometimes smell like rotten eggs. Here we find salt-loving or halophytic plants growing in salty soil. They've adapted their leaves to prevent excessive water loss, aerial roots to absorb oxygen, and take advantage of the water for dispersal of new plants. Now let's examine the 4 types of mangroves found in the Bahamas. The red mangrove is one of 4 types of mangrove plants found in the Bahamas and is the tallest of all local species. The key characteristics of red mangroves are the prop roots, sometimes called stilt roots, derived from the trunk, and drop roots from the branches. And we're going to talk about drop roots in a minute. The red mangrove is the first plant you will encounter if approaching land from the sea. This is the only mangrove with stilt or prop roots. Red mangrove roots have 2 main functions, support and breathing. Their roots trap sediment and help build up the land behind them and improve conditions so that other plants can grow. They help stabilize the sediment and protect the land from storm surge and erosion. It is among the red mangroves that you will often find young fish, conch, and crawfish amongst many other animals. using the red mangrove as a haven and to find food. These trees provide shade that lots of other animals use. The red mangrove, it has large, broad, bright green leaves that terminate with a blunt point. The leaves are waxy, dark green on the upper surface and pale on the lower surface. They have yellow and white flowers with 4 pointed petals. The seedlings or propagules is almost 6 inches long and cigar-shaped. The propagules grow right on the tree and then drop into the water. They float and they use water currents for dispersal. The second tallest species is the black mangrove. Black mangroves are found just behind the red mangroves. Named after its dark bark, the black mangroves are also easily identified by their roots, which grow vertically upward out of the mud and the high tide water level so that their roots can breathe. These breathing roots are called pneumatophores. Black mangroves have pointy, opposite, elliptical green leaves that excrete salt and often are covered in salt crystals on the back. Black mangroves can tolerate much saltier water than the other mangroves and are often found in saline lakes where the salt content or salinity can exceed that of salt water. The bark is dark and scaly. Remember, key characteristics of the black mangroves are the upright roots or pneumatophores, which extend upward from the underground roots above the soil. Living in oxygen-deprived sediment, more than 10,000 pneumatophores may be found under a single tree. The black mangrove has white flowers with 4 petals. They have a green lima bean-shaped fruit or propagule, as they are also called, which are only about 2-3 centimeters long. Black mangrove propagules are also dispersed by water. Just behind the black mangrove, you often find the white mangrove. The white mangrove is not as salt tolerant as the red or black mangroves. The white mangrove is the smallest species existing as a tree or shrub. Like the black mangrove, it also has pneumatophores. However, the white mangrove pneumatophores are not as dense as the black mangrove, and they are often thicker and knobby. Some even grow in the shape of toadstools. Their leaves are broad, flat, oval, rounded at both ends. Each leaf has 2 glands called nectarines at its base that excrete sugar. Many insects feed on this excreted sugar. The leaves of the white mangroves have pinkish stems and are oppositely arranged and are more rounded than the black mangrove. They have white bell-shaped flowers and green ribbed bell-shaped fruit. The last of the tree species is the Buttonwood Mangrove. In the Bahamas, there are two varieties of buttonwood, the green buttonwood and the silver buttonwood. The silver buttonwood has a grayish look to the leaves and is covered with microscopic hairs. However, these are not separate species, they're just varieties. Buttonwoods are often found growing more inland than the other mangroves, and they are good at growing in rocky and very dry, sandy soil. Rather than producing seedlings that germinate on the parent tree, buttonwood flowers are tiny and grow in round clusters with the formation of a button-like seed case. And that's where it gets its name, from these fruits that look like little buttons. The pointed leaves grow alternately and have 2 sugar glands at the base of the leaf stalk for a similar purpose as the white mangrove. Its pointed leaves possess salt glands as openings alternating along the rib, as you can see with that's the other diagram on the underside of the leaf. However, the buttonwood has a regular root system. A very important concept to know when studying mangrove creeks is mangrove zonation. And mangrove zonation describes the order in which the 4 different mangroves are found on land. Remember, the red mangrove is closest to the water, while the buttonwood mangrove is found farthest from the water or deeper inland. Their positions depend on land elevation, water, and soil salt levels, soil salt levels, and tidal changes. In addition to supporting numerous plant and animal species, mangrove creeks are nurseries for fish, crustaceans, and other invertebrates, and sustains fisheries. Roots filter and trap land-based pollutants and sediments that would otherwise run into the ocean and negatively impact coral reefs and seagrass beds. They're also popular sites for recreation and ecotourism. Mangroves also protect the islands of the Bahamas from coastal erosion due to storm surge and hurricanes. It is our second line of defense against storm surges. Remember from the coral reef presentation last week that coral reefs are our first line of defense against storm surge. Walker's Key article. Mr. Wilfred Burroughs and his brother Lennox rode out Hurricane Dorian last year and its ferocious 220-mile-per-hour hurricane winds on a fishing boat anchored in the mangroves near Grand Cay and Abaco. That's the other island that was affected by Hurricane Dorian. The brothers were on a fishing trip near Walker's Key when relatives called and warned them about Hurricane Dorian. Burroughs, who was 48, said he decided to ride out Dorian in the mangroves because they were safe. An illustration of how mangroves help to protect Mr. Burroughs and his brother during the hurricane. Notice how by the time the waves get to the shore, it's basically very calm, and that is what Mr. Burroughs took advantage of. Now let's look at some threats to mangroves in the Bahamas. Climate change is definitely one that we're very concerned about because rising sea levels may disturb zonation. Remember that word. Sea level is rising on an average of 3.5 millimeters per year. The IPC projects a 11 to 98 centimeter rise by the year 2100. Thermal expansion of the warmer sea water, along with melting polar ice and glaciers, contribute to sea level rise. The entire Bahamas can be considered a coastal zone. Most land in the Bahamas is less than 3.28 feet above sea level. That's less than 3.5 feet, people. The highest point in the Bahamas is only 206 feet above sea level on the island of Cat Island, and we call it Mount Alvernia. The Bahamas is listed by the World Bank as one of 10 countries in the world to be most heavily impacted by sea level rise. Just imagine if all the mangrove creeks in the Bahamas disappeared amidst more frequent and stronger hurricanes. By the way, our hurricane season that we're in now does not end until November 30th. In addition to pollution, other human threats include coastal development, overfishing, illegal fishing methods, for example, netting bonefish, which is illegal in the Bahamas, invasive plant and animal species. One of our biggest concerns next to climate change is coastal development. So what are we doing here in the Bahamas? The Bahamas is a signatory to the Ramsar Convention and has a national wetlands policy and is developing local laws to protect mangrove plants and wetlands. Mangrove creeks and wetlands can be included in the marine protected area and national forest estate. Mangroves can be replanted and tidal flow restored when it has been blocked. BREEF works to educate the public about conserving mangroves. And do not practice illegal fishing methods like using nets to catch bonefish. So these are things that you can do. And again, not practicing those things, illegal fishing methods, for instance, you catching bonefish with nets. This is a copy of the BREEF Life in the Mangrove Creek educational poster, which is available online at www.brief.org, where you can find other useful resources that are also available. In summary, we should now know a little bit more about Mangrove Creek ecosystems of the Bahamas. We have identified several human threats to mangrove creeks and efforts to protect them. More importantly, we've seen that in addition to providing high biodiversity, nurseries for marine organisms, trapping 4 times as much carbon as tropical rainforests, filtering and trapping land-based pollutants and sediments, recreation spaces for residents and tourists. Mangrove creeks also serve as our second line of defense against storm surge in protecting the Bahamas from coastal erosion. I want to just show you please join our social media pages and support us. And before I say thank you, I just want to show you a film that was made in conjunction with the Rolex Perpetual Fund about our eco schools here in the Bahamas. Enjoy.
For environmental education, BREEF, through its programs, has been supporting global efforts to educate the youth and increase awareness in climate change mitigation, and has launched a campaign to support our Indian community in this time of need.
There's this amazing network of schools and educators and children in the country that participate in the Eco Schools initiative. What BREEF is doing that's very dynamic is leveraging this network to now build support for affected communities. We're seeing students develop their leadership. We're seeing opportunities for students to help one another and to think about this serious threat that we're facing as a country in climate change, putting young people at the front of that discussion and of solving that amazingly challenging issue that we're facing.
Eco Schools, I think that we're all a really cool community, and we have a different outlook on the way that this whole situation has played out. So I think that just like having that community support is super important right now. We're all in this fight together to create awareness for environment and ensure that we can have a clean, healthy environment for the future. So as Eco Schools, it would be awesome if we all come together.
We thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your contribution, your time, and efforts in relation to this campaign.
Hope lies in the hearts of many, filled with the inspiration of young minds to power our future and create positive change. Take part and offer a helping hand.
Sorry, that was the wrong film, but anyway, it should have been the Rolex film. My apologies. Thank you so much, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you. That was actually a lovely video to share. Also a good takeaway for audience members. You can always send a positive video to the Eco Schools in Bahamas. Next up, we have Olivia, if you would like to take it away.
Okay. Hi, thanks very much, Visa, and thanks very much for that, Kevin. That was extremely interesting. I don't know what everyone else saw. I thought it was absolutely staggering, the difference that those mangroves were making to the waves shown in that demonstration. Amazing. Thanks very much. So my name is Olivia Copsey. I've been involved with the Eco Schools programme for 12 years. I started in Jersey in the Channel Islands, where I come from. Introduced the programme there when I was working for the local government, and then moved to the Indian Ocean, where I became national operator, introducing Eco Schools as a regional programme for the for several countries in the Western Indian Ocean, including Madagascar, Comoros, Mauritius and Zanzibar. And it was there that I first became involved in the area of disaster risk reduction. And in my final year there in 2017, I co-authored a Toolkit for schools in order to support schools who were involved in the Eco Schools programme to increase their resilience to disasters and threats. And particularly that was in response to a cyclone in Madagascar, which affected 80,000 school children in March of 2017, and in fact sadly 81 people lost their lives during that. So the Indian Ocean, like the Caribbean, is extremely vulnerable to different types of natural hazards and natural disasters. Screen is not moving forward.
Maybe with arrows. If not, maybe stop sharing and try again.
Just quickly stop sharing. Sorry about that. Right, here we go. Yes, there we go. Sorry about that, everyone. So I believe that the majority of people in the webinar today are going to be teachers. Yeah. Am I right? So as teachers, I expect that covering natural disasters, hazards, vulnerabilities, capacities may be part of your existing geography programme. For those of you not so familiar with it, I'll quickly run through some of the terminology that is very important when you're working in the area of disaster risk reduction. So start off with, we have hazards. Hazards are a source of potential damage or harm. They may be natural or caused by humans. Vulnerability relates to particular weaknesses in local population and environment and the difficulties that these cause when a disaster occurs. So vulnerability can depend on several factors: people's age, state of health, level of poverty, local environmental and sanitary conditions, as well as the quality of local buildings and their location with respect to any local hazards. Capacity is the combination of all of the strengths and the resources within the community or organisation or society to manage and reduce disaster risks. So these may be known or unknown, and part of our role in disaster risk reduction is recognising capacities and working to reduce them. A disaster is a serious disruption causing widespread human, economic, environmental losses. A disaster is it's important to say that a hazard is not a disaster. A disaster occurs in response to the human population's inability to cope with that hazard. So it's characterized by a disruption of the functioning of any of the community at any scale. It results, as I say, from the combination of hazards, conditions and vulnerability. Important to remember is that a vulnerable and unprepared community population leads to greater disaster impact. So the key thing with disaster risk reduction is to be prepared and work to reduce vulnerabilities and increase resilience. if you could possibly for me put in your chat now, how many of you in the room have recently or in your lifetimes experienced a disaster? I'm just having a look in the chat. Yeah. Yes, a few people. In fact, I feel like we have skipped forward one. In fact, most people have to some level or other experienced a different type of disaster. Arguably, in the last year, all of us have experienced a form of disaster in form of the COVID-19 pandemic, given that the disease itself was a hazard, and our inability as a population, as a global population, to cope with it and have the preparations in place is what's caused the international disaster that is COVID-19. So it's an interesting example to think about when we're talking about disaster risk reduction with our students. What we do know is that when it comes to disasters, children suffer first and they suffer the most. The statistics are quite startling. Every year it's estimated that over 100 million young people, including children, are affected by disasters. 1 in 4 of the world's children live in a conflict or disaster zone, and more than 500 million children are living in areas where they're exposed to the risk of disaster, whether that be through high flood occurrence or areas with high drought severity. Within a disaster, when a disaster occurs, around 30 to 50% of disaster fatalities will be children. It's vital, therefore, that children are involved in disaster risk reduction. So, as I mentioned, in the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, similar to in the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean is extremely vulnerable to different forms of disasters. Cyclones, floods, volcanoes, landslides, and tsunamis have all been experienced within recent living history. As national operator of the Eco Schools Indian Ocean programme, I was approached by the Red Cross because we had an active programme in the schools, and they wanted to see if it was possible for us to help mainstream disaster risk reduction into schools through the Eco Schools programme. From my perspective, Eco Schools was a very appropriate tool to use when working on disaster risk reduction, because of the processes of reviewing and assessing challenges involving the whole school, engaging with the community and locality, and action planning and monitoring. So we were very interested to see how can we work with Eco Schools to improve the capacities of schools and communities to cope before, during and after a disaster, and how and where does disaster risk reduction fit into the existing Eco Schools framework, which I expect you'll all be familiar with. So being new to this area of disaster risk reduction, we did a lot of research and learning before developing our tool. The resulting toolkit is an amalgamation of ideas and approaches which are borrowed from the Red Cross Vulnerability and Capacity Assessment, which is a community-led process of disaster risk reduction. that being very appropriate because Eco Schools is obviously student-led. We also looked at the child-centred disaster risk reduction methodologies of organisations like Plan International, UNICEF and Save the Children. So the aim of this toolkit is to help schools to better understand the vulnerabilities or their own vulnerabilities in relation to risks and hazards they have in their own communities, increase awareness of their own capacities and resilience in the face of risks and hazards. We wanted them to work to turn their capacities into action planning integrated within their current Eco Schools programme, and then take action, turn these ideas into actions which will reduce their students and their families' vulnerability to potential disasters, and increase their capacity to survive and resume their lives after them. So we have 12 activities in all within the toolkit, and what I'd like to do today is talk you through these so that you have an idea of what the process looks like, of that we came up with in any way of working on disaster risk reduction in an eco school. The first one I would like to do with you, it's an introductory activity, and I wonder if using the chat feature on Zoom we can try and do this together. I'm just going to have a look and put the chat up now. Right, so the activity is called a body map. It's something that we do with the students themselves, asking them to lie on the floor, either on a big piece of paper or on the sand, if that's more appropriate, and we draw around them. You may want to separate the groups into boys and girls if that works better for you. The key thing is to keep the groups small, because sometimes this can be quite an emotive activity. It really gets them thinking about disasters and how it might affect them if it were to happen. Sometimes if you've had recent experience of a disaster, this can especially be quite emotive for the kids. So the idea is you draw around a person, so you have an outline of a person on the ground in front of you, and then you go through the different parts of the body, and we're asking them how could a disaster or emergency affect you. So the first question is, how could it affect the way you think, your mind, or your education? Could anybody put an answer in the chat? See it? Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Christina. Fear, sadness, they may have lost somebody, they may have lost a home, and distraction as well. How can you start to concentrate after something like this? And as well, gosh, it could make you feel quite hopeless. What could you do? What could you have done to change it? How are you going to prevent it from happening in the future? Again, anxiety, yeah, really trauma, anxiety, all of those things are going to be affecting children when a disaster strikes. The second question, their eyes. So pointing to their eyes in the picture, what would you see? What would they see during and following an emergency? any answers? Thinking of things like the destruction of their environment, their homes. Exactly, yeah. Upset parents, people running away. Quite right. All very scary for young children. What might they hear during and after an emergency? We've already had it from Nanik. People screaming, running, crying. What about their mouths? How might people communicate to them? And how might they communicate to others? Pamela, crying, fighting, shouting. Absolutely. Their main body, how might it affect their health? This is something that's probably one of the most obvious impacts of an emergency. They may be injured. After an emergency, there may be loss of water supplies, increasing diseases. There may also be, if there is a loss of parental support, they might also be more vulnerable to they might be more vulnerable to abuse and things like that. So it's really important that they're taken care of after an emergency, and that's going to be something that's going to be on their minds. Who's going to look after them? How might the emergency affect their feelings, and how might it change the way they feel about different people in their community? And we've already mentioned loss of parents, family members, homes. And again, arms and hands, what kinds of activities would they be more or less involved in after an emergency situation? So how's this going to affect and change life as they know it? So this, as I mentioned before, it can be a really emotive activity and something to do with great care, but really will engage everybody into this whole scenario of how we're going to be affected by disasters. So you might have heard me mention just earlier a child-centered approach to disaster risk reduction. Why is it important to use a child-centered approach? Well, there's several reasons. The first being children bring a unique perspective in the occurrence of a disaster. Evidence has shown that they have the ability to improve a community's overall resilience to disaster because of their unique perspective and also their unique vulnerability. They are also very creative, so they are able to address different vulnerabilities and challenges in creative ways. And I'm sure we've all seen that in our own classrooms before. Children are effective communicators of risk to each other and their communities, both before, in terms of preparation for disaster and during disaster. They can be empowered to take action, therefore. So if they understand more about the risks that they face and they feel more involved in it, then they feel more empowered to raise the alarm when disaster strikes. It's also enshrined in the children's human rights that they should be involved in disaster. They have several rights which are relevant here. Right to participation being the key one in terms of a child-centered approach, right to safety, survival, protection from violence and harm, adequate healthcare, participation in education. Finally, adult-led approaches can be limited in success. This is because often adults choose rote learning when it comes to preparing children for an event. So an example here would be the drop, cover and hold, which is one possibility, which is one approach when an earthquake, for example, strikes. But if the approach to teaching the children has been too specific without enough reflection and participation, it's possible that the children can misunderstand the application of the instruction in the face of a disaster. So often in a disaster, what will save you is your reflexes, your gut feeling and gut instinct. I need to run, I need to get help, I need to move away. And if you're trying to memorize something that you've learned at school, then you might be in the wrong place when you apply that instruction. Can anybody else think of any other reasons why it might be good to involve children in prevention of disasters, identification and prevention of hazards and disasters in their own community? Give you a second to think about that and answer. So I'll stop talking if a message comes up in the chat, but my thing, and I don't know how you all feel, is that the feeling of powerlessness brilliant, thank you, Pamela, you've just said exactly what I was going to say. So children need to be empowered as stakeholders in order to feel that they have some control in a situation which is going to shake their entire world. They need to have the knowledge and some skills available to them to help them understand what's happening and to help them to participate in the immediate response and recovery. And this is important for children in terms of their psychosocial ability to deal with the trauma. They need to prepare. So thank you very much for those responses. Just as Pamela says, children need to be stakeholders, but not in the way of the Flintstones here. What we really needed to do is develop a student-led process, which includes children and youth as stakeholders in the disaster risk reduction process. That's as eco-schools what we felt was needed in order to best help our schools to prepare. So the second part of the toolkit, the second activity, moves straight in to a mapping exercise. Mapping is a really important part of disaster risk reduction. You'll find if you look at the toolkit, which I'm happy to share afterwards, you'll find that it's a recurrent theme. What we ask them schools to do is produce a school map and a community map, and this provides the basis for identifying risks and vulnerabilities. On the map, we can include the location of health clinics, schools, water sources and shelter. We can identify locations at particular risk and identify which groups are vulnerable. Interestingly, this may be different according to boys or girls who may choose to highlight some areas rather than others. This can be done on a piece of paper or on it can be done on the sand if necessary, but then it needs to be photographed and replicated. The best place for it would be a school wall or an eco schools notice board, and the maps that you develop will be revisited throughout the process. Mapping is followed by transect walks. Transect walks could almost be compared to an eco schools review, environmental review. What it is a matter of within a group walking around the school first and then into the local community and looking at the surroundings, assessing where are the hazards, where are the vulnerabilities, so that all of this information can be brought back to school and put into the map that you're producing. And there's some questions, same as with the Eco Schools environmental review, there's some questions that they're going to answer. And when they move into the community, they can ask these questions of local community members. We're looking at the different communities, conditions in the community, what are the houses and buildings like, key facilities observed, health centres, shops, radio centres. Are there any differences in the way that people interact? So it's important not just to look at what the physical structures are, but also the types of communities and the types of interaction in those communities, which are the safe places, which are areas which may not be safe to go into. Are there areas which the students strongly associate with particular hazards at this point? So we're moving into identification of different hazards. We will also then, from there, we start to look at the types of disasters, histories that have actually affected our own communities. So that is two different activities, one called a disaster history profile and the other one is seasonal calendar, and these are done with the families back at home. So both of these are often set as pieces of homework or learning that they'll do during free time. It's about speaking to your parents, your grandparents, and understanding what has happened in our community before. So starting again to identify what kinds of hazards do we have, what types of things or potential disasters have affected our community in the past. The seasonal calendar is about looking more closely to the types of vulnerabilities and hazards in the community and working out what times of year may they occur. So actually starting to look really closely at, let's analyse what might happen in our community and let's analyse when it's most likely to happen. You'll notice that health is part of that. Flus, coughs, colds. In the COVID scenario, it's been important to look at the flu season, and we're responding now, especially, well, certainly for me in the UK, everybody's responding to COVID with the bearing in mind that the flu season is coming up as well. Looking as well, this might also lead into discussion on climate change. Are the disasters getting worse over time? We then move into hazard ranking. So this is an opportunity to gather all the information that we have on the hazards. There's an activity that makes it easy for the pupils to do this with small cards, and then they're organising, ranking these. This hazard ranking and vulnerability assessment can be done in a very interactive way using handfuls of rice or beans onto a chart. So we're looking at which of the hazards that we might face are our priority for action. Transforming the vulnerabilities and into capacities is the next step. it's a very positive part of the process. We're having looked at the vulnerabilities, at the hazards and the vulnerabilities. You're then guided to turn the particular vulnerabilities that you have in the community into capacities by identifying, according to this vulnerability, what do we have available to us to help and reduce the potential threat. And very important and appropriate for eco schools is the stakeholder identification and mapping. This is where we now look, knowing much more about our own hazards and our own vulnerabilities, what kinds of organisations, individuals are around us in our communities that can help us, and what links do we need to establish as a school in order to prepare for emergencies and disasters. It's important to note that the Eco Schools Vulnerability and Capacity Assessment that you'll do through this toolkit is not an emergency response plan in itself, but it will provide you with a lot more nuanced information from the point of view of the children in order to feed into an emergency response plan. It will also help you identify important community partners that you can bring in to get involved. The results of the VCA that we've just done can be used as well in advocacy. You can use it as a way to raise awareness from the point of view of the children as to what the hazards are and help the communities and families to respond. And looking at helping supporting the mainstreaming of disaster risk reduction into regional and even national disaster risk recovery agency plans. So thank you very much. That's all from me. And my email address is right there in front of you. Please feel free to contact me afterwards if you'd like a copy of the toolkit that I've presented today. Otherwise, I assume you could also contact the FEE head office who have a copy as well. But thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for that really wonderful presentation. That was very practical tools. So yeah, if any of the audience members want to contact Olivia, she shared her email. Perhaps Olivia and Kevin, you could both put your emails into the chat in case anyone wants to contact you about your presentation or any other information. Before we end, I just wanted to share some of the tools that FEE and Eco Schools have gathered about disaster risk reduction and the campaign. So this is the Eco Schools Children for Children campaign website. On it, we have general information about the campaign. If your school wants to participate in the campaign, you can register through this form. If you'd like to donate, you can also do it through this website. And then we have a number of educational materials that students, teachers, and schools can use to help run the campaign, learn about climate change, learn about disaster risk reduction. It includes this Eco Schools Indian Ocean Toolkit that Olivia helped create. So that can also be found on our website. And then FEE Eco Schools team, educational program teams have also created a lesson plan. It's a 3-part lesson plan about climate change, disaster risk reduction, and running an awareness and fundraising campaign. The general outcomes of this and the learning objectives are for students to develop a better understanding of climate change, of disaster risk reduction, of resilience, and then the skills to run campaigns and actually have like a positive impact and take action. So we've divided it into 3 parts. The first is just a general overview of climate change, a way to introduce it. There's videos, there's games. The second part is specifically about disaster risk reduction and uses some of the tools mentioned in the EcoSchools Indian Ocean Toolkit, and is also can be focused specifically on the Bahamas. And then the last section is about organizing a fundraising and awareness campaign, giving students the actual breakdown of how to set that up and how to take charge and how to run that in their own schools. This resource has been compiled through a number of different educational resources. It should be able to be adapted to also do it online or through distance learning, given COVID crisis at the moment. And it can be used by EcoSchools or YRE program, or just integrated into the general curriculum. So this is also available for people, teachers, schools on our EcoSchools website. So with that, are there any questions from the audience members? Did I miss anything?
I think there were 2, and one is, I think it's to Kevin from Yanin. What percentage of disaster recovery is natural disaster based? I think it was maybe from, in general, from the Bahamas, or?
To repeat the question, I'm having to compete with some liquid sunshine, some rain. Let's repeat the question for me. Is it in the chat?
Yes, it was in the chat.
What percentage of disaster recovery is by natural disasters? Perhaps, I guess, what percentage of disasters are caused by natural disasters?
In the Bahamas, I would say 100, because basically it's a matter of, for us, it's always been the hurricanes, you know, and before Dorian, there were a couple others, and every time there's a different set of islands that are affected. This year it was Abaco and Grand Bahama. A year ago, I think it was Ragged Island that's still trying to recover. A couple of years before that, New Providence got some damage, not as far as disaster, you know, calling it a disaster, but I would say 100% is basically based on natural for us, and it's basically hurricane based.
Great. Anything else? If not, a big thank you to both of our speakers. Thank you, Olivia and Kevin. Thank you to our participants for joining this webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. And on that note, I will shut this meeting. I hope everyone has a good rest of the evening and the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.